The seventh Grand Peace Summit of the Intergalactic Council was a catastrophe long before it officially commenced. The location, Or-2, a floating bureaucratic nightmare disguised as a space station, was an architectural marvel only in the sense that it completely ignored logic and practicality. Constructed by a committee with zero experience in designing space-based structures, it boasted features such as conference rooms without entrances, corridors that led nowhere, and an air filtration system that wheezed like it had given up on life. Dana Reed arrived precisely on time, which, by council standards, meant she was already 2 hours early. She adjusted her dark blue uniform, the universally recognized attire of an underappreciated diplomatic functionary, and took in the scene of total disarray. The GROW delegation was mid-argument over seating protocols, using their characteristic aggressive gesturing that resembled an angry mime swatting imaginary insects. The Orans were obsessively scrutinizing the catering menu, their fur transitioning from burnt orange, anxiety, to muted teal, tentative approval. Meanwhile, the Vels, a sentient species of gelatinous goo, were entangled in a debate over whether to split up and attend multiple panels or stick together as one large wobbling mass. Dana exhaled slowly. Another year, another summit destined to achieve absolutely nothing. Her assigned seat was in the farthest corner, squeezed between a non-functional emergency exit and a potted plant that, inexplicably, had received official delegation credentials. She was used to this. Humans weren't exactly a dominant force within the council. To other species, they were little more than space janitors, reliable for grunt work, but not treated with much respect. That was perfectly fine with her. As the Grand Chancellor began his introductory address, which included no fewer than 17 subclauses, Dana's attention began to drift. She had a knack for spotting inconsistencies. And something didn't add up. The maintenance staff patrolling the room's perimeter were too competent. Orion 12's repair crews were infamous for their ineptitude. Just last year, an engineer had accidentally locked himself in a supply closet for 3 days, and it required a full council hearing just to assign blame for opening the door. But these workers moved with efficiency and coordination. Her eyes narrowed. One of them, a large figure in a poorly sized jumpsuit, reached for his tool belt, and she caught a glimpse of a concealed weapon. Dana exhaled sharply. Of course, there was no way this summit could proceed without some kind of crisis. And here it was. A highly organized terrorist cell had infiltrated the most poorly secured facility in the galaxy. She scanned the room. The Grows were still gesturing wildly. The Thruns were running probability models to determine the likelihood of lunch arriving on time. The Orans were now arguing over whether the tablecloth color scheme was an insult to their culture. Nobody else had noticed. Dana leaned back in her seat, projecting boredom, but her mind was already in overdrive. She had no weapon, but she had something better: invisibility through insignificance. Time to test a theory. She stood up and casually made her way toward the back exit, the one that famously didn't work. One of the maintenance workers subtly shifted his position, just enough to block her path while pretending it was unintentional. Bingo! She turned away and walked toward the refreshments table instead, where a 6-armed alien bartender was juggling drinks with flair. She picked a random glass, took a sip, and winced. It tasted like carbonated remorse. Feigning interest in the abysmal drink, she surveyed the room again. 7 of them, each positioned near vital points, security panels, emergency exits, and one far too close to the main power conduit. She checked her watch. If she had to guess, she had 5 minutes before they made their move. Exactly 4 minutes and 59 seconds later, the station lights flickered and a deep voice rang out. Attention, Intergalactic Council. We are the People's Liberation Front of Universal Justice. This station is now under our command. Chaos followed. The Thruns began frantically crunching survival probabilities. The Oran's fur turned a vivid magenta, the universal sign of shock. The Vels attempted to silently ooze out of the room. And the bless them, started an entirely new debate over whether surrendering was an act of cowardice or strategy. Dana sighed and took another sip of her revolting drink. No one had noticed her, which meant she was free to do what she did best: solve the problem before anyone realized she was the most dangerous individual in the room. Emergency sirens howled, a noise that sounded more like a stressed AI groaning in existential fatigue than an alarm. The central holographic screen blinked to life, revealing a masked figure standing stiffly with the air of someone who had practiced this speech in front of a mirror far too many times. The voice, robotic and painfully monotone, began. Citizens of the Intergalactic Council, we are the People's Liberation Front of Universal Justice. We have taken control of this station, and we demand... A pause. The masked figure glanced off screen, clearly receiving frantic whispered instructions. We demand equitable redistribution of intergalactic resources, an end to bureaucratic delays in planetary aid, and more whispering. Improved snack options at future summits. The chamber exploded into chaos again. One particularly muscular GROW delegate roared, "The GROW delegation will never negotiate with terrorists," while raising a clenched fist, sparking another round of heated debate over whether the correct term was hostages or temporarily detained guests. The Thruns were furiously tapping on datapads, running simulations on explosion survival rates, diplomacy success metrics, and structural stress predictions. Spoiler, Orion 12's integrity was on par with a damp tissue. The Orans had shifted to a deep shade of existential purple, while the Vels tried to camouflage themselves against the furniture. The masked figure let out a long sigh and pressed a button on their wrist. Chamber doors slammed shut with a foreboding thud, and the guards, previously disguised as janitorial staff, stepped forward, weapons drawn. Any effort to resist will be pointless, the ringleader announced, sounding like he was reading from a badly rehearsed script. We now command the station's security protocols, life support systems, and just then, the station's AI cut in with a flat synthetic voice. Correction. Unauthorized personnel have accessed critical subsystems. However, due to obsolete software and unresolved maintenance requests, functionality cannot be guaranteed. Would you like to lodge a formal complaint? The leader faltered. No, acknowledged. Submitting a complaint on your behalf. Expected response time, 6 to 8 weeks. Dana smirked. Orion 12 may have been a bureaucratic disaster zone, but that made it nearly impossible to conquer effectively. Sure, the hijackers had taken over a few key systems, but there were backups, endless backups, and layers upon layers of administrative red tape. She had a sneaking suspicion they'd already submitted a form without realizing it. While the negotiations, more accurately, a chaotic shouting contest, dragged on, Dana ran through her checklist. The hostages were distracted. The intruders were skilled, but not immune to the station's absurd inefficiencies. And the AI? As always, completely worthless in a real emergency. Perfect. That meant she had space to maneuver. Dana began inching toward the back of the chamber, keeping her movements subtle. It wasn't difficult. No one paid attention to the human liaison. In the eyes of most of the council, she was just a low-tier administrative cog, a glorified note-taker. She preferred it that way. Her first task, discreetly access the station's internal systems without triggering the hijackers' suspicion. Thankfully, she'd memorized every last security blind spot in this absurd excuse for a summit venue. There was a maintenance panel tucked behind the refreshment table, the same table she'd already been lingering around earlier. She grabbed a plate of the Oran's so-called diplomatic crackers, a snack so flavorless it had once been declared a neutral arbitration tool, and slipped a tiny device from her sleeve. It looked like an ordinary data drive. It wasn't. With a smooth motion, she plugged it into the maintenance port and initiated a covert override. The terrorists were good, but they didn't know Orion 12's labyrinthine security layers like she did. The system was a tangled mess. Outdated firewalls, contradictory permissions, and one critical update that required a handwritten sign-off from a council member who'd retired centuries ago. In other words, Dana had the upper hand. Within moments, she had partial control over the environmental settings. It wasn't much. She couldn't unlock doors or disable weapons, but she could make things unpleasant. She lowered the temperature by exactly 4 degrees, barely perceptible, but enough. The air circulation shifted ever so slightly, increasing the humidity just enough to cause discomfort without being obvious. It was subtle psychological warfare. The Grows fidgeted in their elaborate robes, clearly irritated. The Orans' fur bristled in reaction to the faint humidity shift. The Thruns, ever the math nerds, immediately began recalculating their probability models. And the hijackers? They were beginning to sweat. Literally. One of them tugged at his collar. Another blinked rapidly and looked around nervously. Even the leader, so confident at first, paused before continuing his speech. Dana allowed herself a small smile. She wasn't going to confront them head-on. That would be foolish. No, her strategy was simpler. Make them squirm. Make them second-guess. Distract them until their nerves unraveled. Then, take them apart, quietly, piece by piece. Because if the Intergalactic Council had taught her anything, it was this. The most dangerous person in the room isn't the one yelling the loudest. It's the one who understands how the system really works, while everyone else is too busy arguing to notice. The artificial climate of the station hummed softly as Dana's tweaks took effect. The Grows, unused to thermal changes, shifted awkwardly in their seats, their armored skin twitching as they debated whether discomfort was a form of dishonor or simply a mild nuisance. The Orans, fur rippled with confused gradients of color, their diplomatic instincts thrown into chaos as they tried to assign meaning to the environmental shift. The Thruns had abandoned their original calculations and were now working on a new model, estimating hostage survival odds under moderate yet persistently inconvenient humidity conditions. Meanwhile, the intruders were getting agitated. Dana watched closely as one of them, a twitchy guy in an ill-fitting jumpsuit, began to fidget. He wiped the sweat from his brow, and the weapon he'd once held with firm authority now drooped slightly in his grasp. Nudging the person beside him, he muttered, "Is it just me, or is it starting to feel oddly humid in here?" The other insurgent, whose mask had shifted awkwardly after too many adjustments, frowned. "This is a space station. It's supposed to have climate control." Exactly. The leader of the hijackers, still projected prominently on the main screen, clearly sensed the shift in the room's energy. He slammed his fist onto what Dana assumed was a dramatic-looking control interface. "Stay alert," he barked. "We are in command. This station belongs to us. Don't let insignificant atmospheric shifts pull your focus from the mission." Dana allowed herself a tiny, knowing grin. Insignificant, he'd said. Perfect. The thing about Orion 12, as she'd come to understand, was that everything seemed minor, until it wasn't. She leaned casually back against the refreshments table, pretending to inspect a strange array of alien hors d'oeuvres. In reality, she discreetly slipped another instruction into the system. This time, her target was a ventilation duct positioned near the hostage takers. With a faint hiss, a barely perceptible stream of ionized air began to flow, just enough to cause mild irritation on exposed skin. It wasn't harmful or overt, just bothersome. The leader, now visibly agitated, turned to his team again. "Can we focus, please? We are making history here. The Council will have no choice but to recognize our demands." "Which demands?" someone called out from the group. An awkward pause followed. "What do you mean, which demands?" the leader snapped. "The last draft I saw mentioned universal economic reform, breaking up planetary monopolies, and something about, unionizing janitorial staff," another rebel offered. No, that was the internal briefing," someone else countered. "The actual demands were about military de-escalation and interspecies education reform." "Wait," chimed in a third. "Weren't we prioritizing food rationing improvements?" A fourth added, scratching his neck. "All I'm saying is if we don't have a clear agenda, people won't take us seriously." Dana covered a smirk with a sip of her horrendous drink. This was playing out better than she had hoped. Confusion, a lack of cohesion, and now a sprinkle of paranoia. Beautiful. The leader's body language shifted. He knew control was slipping from his hands. He turned back to the hostages, ready to speak, when one of the side doors creaked, barely opening before halting with a mechanical clunk. Everyone in the room went still. Dana hadn't unlocked anything. She'd simply activated one of the station's ancient repair requests, one that had been sitting unresolved since the last summit, forcing the system to perform a test override. One of the rebels spun around, alarmed. "What was that?" "It's nothing," the leader snapped, but his voice carried a tremor of uncertainty now. Still playing the role of the indifferent government liaison, Dana calmly placed her drink back on the table and exhaled softly. "Time to escalate." She moved subtly toward a dormant security terminal, knowing full well the intruders had commandeered the primary control panels. What they didn't realize, however, was that Orion 12 had so many redundant systems, layered through decades of bureaucratic disagreement, that dozens of parallel subsystems existed, none of which followed the same protocols. With a quick flick of her wrist, she accessed an outdated emergency override no one had touched in over 10 years. A blinking prompt appeared. Initiate facility emergency procedures? Dana pressed yes. A chipper, almost annoyingly pleasant automated voice, clearly not the same as the station AI, rang out over the intercom. Attention, honored delegates and guests. Due to recent security threats, Orion 12 is activating emergency safety protocols. Please remain calm as we secure your continued well-being. Thank you for your patience. The room went utterly silent. Then, without warning, a thick mist, faintly purple in hue, sprayed from the ceiling, dousing the room for a precise 3 seconds. Nobody moved. Then chaos. What is this? A Grow shouted, yanking at his now damp ceremonial robes. Is this some kind of biological assault? The Orin's fur turned a frantic yellow, panic coloring their response. We are under chemical attack, someone yelped. Caught completely off guard, the rebel leader flinched. Wait, what? The automated voice carried on cheerfully. Safety feature engaged. Non-lethal compliance mist has been deployed. This mist is formulated to temporarily reduce hostile tendencies in tense scenarios. Possible side effects include mild disorientation, excessive blinking, and an intense sensation of social embarrassment. Please stay seated. More shouting. More confusion. Dana let out a quiet breath through her nose. She loved the compliance mist. Not because it worked, it didn't, but because it made people deeply, deeply uncomfortable. Now coated in a faintly glowing purple residue, the terrorists exchanged uncertain glances. I feel weirdly self-aware, one of them admitted. Another tugged at his mask. Is everyone staring at us? The Groks had begun arguing about whether it was dishonorable to be hit with pacification spray. The Orins instinctively started apologizing to each other. The Thruns were now recalculating their survival rates under conditions of mild social awkwardness. The leader of the hijackers straightened up, clearly scrambling to regain authority. This doesn't change anything, he shouted. We're still in control. We have weapons. We. At that exact moment, the compliance mist had now fully taken effect. The leader hesitated, clearly unsettled. Why is everyone staring at me? He murmured, shifting uneasily. One of his subordinates leaned in. Boss, you're kind of glowing. He glanced at his hands. Sure enough, a faint fluorescent sheen shimmered on his skin. Dana nonchalantly leaned against the refreshments table, observing as a slow, creeping wave of embarrassment spread among the hijackers. The leader clenched his fists, visibly attempting to resist the mist's psychological influence, but it was no use. He cleared his throat. This is still a hostage takeover. He faltered. Why do I feel like I just embarrassed myself in front of my entire extended family? Dana couldn't help but smile. Perfect timing. Now it was time for the final act. She was going to convince them that a special forces unit dispatched by the council was en route, an elite strike team that didn't actually exist. All she needed was a bit of fear and confusion, and they'd cave on their own. The compliance mist had done its job flawlessly. The once fearless hijackers, now glowing faintly purple and overwhelmed by a deep, inexplicable sense of secondhand shame, were starting to unravel. Their leader shifted awkwardly, his entire stance betraying growing self-doubt as it silently spread through his ranks. Dana remained unnoticed, just the way she liked it. She inhaled slowly and mentally reviewed her next moves. Sure, the hijackers were still armed, but their confidence was hanging by a thread. The delegates, meanwhile, were too busy arguing over whether the compliance mist breached intergalactic ethical regulations to be of any real help. As for the station AI, bless its malfunctioning circuits, it had locked itself in a never-ending customer service mode and was now sending out satisfaction surveys about the hostage crisis. In other words, everything was going according to plan. Dana moved to the far end of the chamber, slipping through the mayhem with practiced ease. She paused beside a lesser-known security console, an auxiliary unit so outdated and obscure, the hijackers hadn't even noticed it. Like everything else on Orion 12, the panel required its own arcane set of bureaucratic approvals and was buried in poorly written documentation. Exactly the kind of neglected system Dana specialized in. She plugged in her data stick and quietly executed a stealth override. The station's surveillance feeds flickered. She scrolled through them swiftly until she found what she was looking for. The hijackers had established a command center in one of Orion 12's upper observation domes. They'd bypassed primary control systems, locked down the docking ports, and rerouted communications. Their leader was broadcasting from a fortified room, giving the impression he had total authority over the facility. But Dana knew something they didn't. Orion 12 was a bureaucratic maze, layers upon layers of overlapping permissions and redundant clearance structures. Sure, the hijackers had accessed some top-level systems, but they had barely scratched the surface of the station's full administrative complexity. And Dana was about to use that to her advantage. She accessed the intercom controls. The leader was in the middle of another grandiose speech when a new voice interrupted, a voice that had never existed. It was one Dana had pieced together herself in real time using archived audio from old Council military broadcasts. "Attention, hostile occupiers," it boomed with crisp authority. "This is Strike Team Omega. We have infiltrated Orion 12. Surrender immediately." The room fell into a deep silence. The leader froze, his body tense. "What? Who?" Dana kept her face carefully neutral, maintaining the facade she had meticulously set up. "All hostile forces are hereby ordered to lower their weapons. Counter-invasion units are taking their positions. Non-compliance will result in immediate neutralization." She subtly adjusted the environmental controls once more. The lights flickered. The artificial gravity wavered for a fraction of a second, and a blast of cold air surged from the vents. The impact was instant. Panic. One of the terrorists spun around. "Wait, they sent a strike team?" Another, already on edge, backed into the wall. They never mentioned anything about a military response. I thought this was supposed to be a political operation. The leader raised his weapon, trying to regain command. "Hold your ground. This could be." Dana activated the next phase of her strategy. With a single keystroke, she unleashed all non-lethal security drones across the station. A swarm of small, spherical, semi-intelligent robots powered up. These weren't combat drones. Originally, they had been designed for routine maintenance and pest control. However, they had one particularly useful feature, a built-in high-frequency sound generator. Dana switched them to deterrence mode. Then they began to emit a loud, high-pitched, inhuman shriek that echoed throughout the station's halls. The terrorists lost control. One dropped his weapon, hands clutching his ears. Another darted for the exit, only to recall that the doors were still locked. The leader, drenched in sweat, took a step back. "What's going on?" Then Dana delivered the final blow. She activated the intercom again, this time distorting her voice to create a robotic, mechanical tone. "You are surrounded. Surrender now." The leader snapped. No. We prepared for this. We accounted for everything." And then the compliance missed. The shift in humidity, the paranoia, the embarrassment, the flashing lights, the screeching maintenance drones, and the entirely fabricated elite military unit, each element contributing to a perfect storm of psychological collapse. "We surrender!" One of the terrorists yelled, hurling his rifle to the floor. A second followed, then a third, and so on. Finally, the leader, the once feared mastermind of this operation, took a shaky breath, lowered his weapon, and pressed a button on his wrist communicator. "Stand down," he muttered. Chaos erupted in the room. The Grows immediately began vying for credit for the surrender. The Thruns updated their survival probability charts in real time. The Orcs, still rattled by lingering panic, began drafting a formal apology to the terrorists for the unfortunate misunderstanding. The Vels slowly emerged from their camouflage spots, pretending to have been involved in the entire operation all along. As for Dana, she simply watched. One by one, the terrorists fell to their knees, hands on their heads, while the non-existent elite strike team failed to show. The station's AI, still utterly ineffective, announced security alert resolved. Please fill out a post-crisis survey to rate your hostage experience. Your feedback is important to us. Meanwhile, the Council's actual security forces, who had been trapped in their own bureaucratic maze, struggling to approve emergency protocols, finally arrived, storming the chamber with weapons drawn. They were greeted by a room full of subdued terrorists and a group of very smug-looking Grows arguing over the best way to formally accept the surrender. Dana leaned against the refreshment table, exhaled, and grabbed another drink. She deserved it. No one noticed her. No one questioned why the terrorists had so suddenly surrendered. No one suspected that the entire thing had been orchestrated by the most unremarkable person in the room. The Intergalactic Council, true to form, immediately descended into a bureaucratic nightmare of paperwork, official statements, and squabbles over who technically resolved the crisis. Dana didn't care. She had won, and as always, no one would ever give her credit for it.